In this video, we'll talk about hot topics in the Pastoral Epistles. The Pastoral, for many, whether lay people or scholars, who consider the Pastoral Epistles to be written by Paul, they often view Paul in a negative light because of some of the topics and discussion that we see in the Pastoral Epistles, though we also see this picked up in other places throughout the New Testament as well. We're going to focus on three major topics in this video that are often points of contention, whether for lay people, confessional Christians, or scholars. These are slavery, homosexuality, and women's roles in the church and everyday life. The way that the Pastoral Epistles, as well as some other points in the Pauline Epistles, which we'll mention in passing, address these issues is often contentious and negative. This leads many people to want to throw out the Pastoral Epistles altogether, sometimes even all of Paul's writings, and focus on the other parts of the New Testament. We'll begin by talking about slavery in the Pastoral Epistles. The Greco-Roman world had slavery. This was a way of life, and many people owned slaves. There was a slave trade going on. It wasn't simply people selling themselves into slavery, but an actual trading of slaves and selling them. In Jewish culture, slavery was a bit different. Jews had slaves, and sometimes they were captured in battle, but oftentimes the slaves were actually Jews or Hebrews who had sold themselves into slavery to repay debts or because they could not afford to live on their own. In Jewish custom, slaves had to be released in the 7th year unless they decided to stay on. We see some discussion of slavery in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy 6 says, "Let all who are under the yoke of slavery regard their masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be blasphemed. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful to them on the ground that they are members of the church. Rather, they must serve them all the more, since those who benefit by their service are believers and beloved." This discussion we see in 1 Timothy seems to indicate that the author wants the slaves to stay slaves and not rebel against their masters, which is often a point of contention for Christians, scholars, and other people reading the text that we see here. We also see some discussion of this in Titus. In Titus 2, 9-10, the author says, "Tell slaves to be submissive to their masters, and to give satisfaction in every respect. They are not to talk back, not to pilfer, but to show complete and perfect fidelity, so that in everything they may be an ornament to the doctrine of God our Savior." So one of the questions we have here is, what do we do with the discussion of slavery we see in the Pastoral Epistles? We, of course, see slavery mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. But the discussion that we see in the Pastoral Epistles seems to indicate that slaves must stay submissive to their masters and cannot rebel against them because it is unchristian. This discussion that we see in the Pastoral Epistles is quite a bit different from what we see in texts like Galatians as well. In Galatians 3:28, Paul writes, "There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free," and so on. So at what point do we differentiate between the writing that we see in Galatians and what we see in 1 Timothy and Titus? We also see a focus on slave trading in 1 Timothy 1, 9-11. The author writes here, "This means understanding that the law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their mother or father, for murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and so on." We see this focus on slave traders here, which obviously is put in a negative light. These are the lawless and disobedient, and the godless and sinful. 1 Timothy and Titus seem to be indicating that slaves, no matter their position, if they are Christian, must remain loyal to their master. However, the author does argue that slave trading is bad and godless and sinful. What do we do with this kind of discussion? One way to think about this is possibly the author saying that Christians should try to fit in and not draw attention to themselves, which seems to be the context of other passages, like in 1 Corinthians when women were supposed to cover their heads, in order not to present themselves as sexually available, which would have been what most people would have assumed if the women had not covered their heads. What we do with slavery is not really clear. The issue we see in the New Testament is not something that transitions to the 21st century American world. We do see clearly that the authors of 1 Timothy and Titus do expect slaves, if they are Christian, to still be loyal and submissive to their masters, though this could possibly be them trying to fit in and not draw attention to Christianity. The discussion of homosexuality in the Pastoral Epistles is quite a bit different from what we see about slavery. With the discussion of slavery, what we read on the surface is relatively what was intended by the text. However, the discussion of homosexuality is quite a bit different and more nuanced through our 21st century English reading of the text versus the 1st, possibly 2nd century Greek text. To understand the discussion we see here, we first have to understand Greco-Roman culture and its emphasis on homosexuality. In Greco-Roman culture, it was quite common to have homosexual relationships. One way that this happened was pederasty. Pederasty was when there was a relationship between a much older male and a younger male who engaged in some kind of sexual relationship, usually in the context of learning, like Greek philosophers might. Prostitution, whether male or female, was common in the religious cults in Greco-Roman culture as well. Greco-Roman culture also did not have any problem with males having relationships sexually, romantically, etc. with other males. For example, males in the Greco-Roman world would usually have some kind of sexual and or romantic relationship with each other in addition to a wife. The wife was oftentimes simply there for childbearing purposes, while the two men had a stronger relationship because they believed that they could connect with one another more than they could connect with a woman, who was not believed to be as intelligent and capable of understanding. We see some discussion of homosexuality in 1 Timothy. Again, we've looked at this passage about slave traders, but we see it again here. I want to focus on the word sodomites. Now, this is the NRSV translation, which translates the word that we see in Greek as sodomites. In Greek, we see the word arsenokoitais, which I've put here in Greek as well. Now, our discussion of this word is pretty important to understanding these texts. However, most scholars are not 100% sure about what the word actually means. We do not see it in many Greek literature anywhere, and the New Testament is one place that we see this a couple times. This word comes from two different Greek words, arsein, which means male, and koite, which means bed. So the word means something about men and beds. What the word means specifically is, again, up for debate. Many people argue that this word is talking about pederasty, or possibly about prostitution. There's also a focus in Greco-Roman culture about how the active partner in a sexual relationship is the one exerting power. And what we see in the New Testament, as well as the Pastoral Epistles, is possibly a pushback on the power struggle and an emphasis on equality instead. We also see the word sodomite used in many translations of this text. So we want to go back really briefly to Genesis 19, where we see the story of Sodom. In Sodom, we see the story of Lot staying in the city of Sodom, and these angels come to the town in an effort to help Lot prove that there are just men left in the city. The angels come to the town, and the men of Sodom come out to rape these angels, not knowing that they're actually divine beings, seemingly. Lot lets the two angels into his house, and as we see in Genesis 19, the text says, Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. While we get the word sodomite used in translation of the text we see in 1 Timothy, often, even our understanding of that word is quite a bit different from what the text intended. Genesis 19, as well as discussion of it in Ezekiel and Hebrews, is about hospitality and the dangers of not being hospitable. The men of Sodom obviously had wives and reproduced and had children. The issue at hand there was not homosexuality, but rather that the men of Sodom were being inhospitable, as opposed to Lot, who was welcoming strangers into his home to provide them food and lodging. What we do with the topic of homosexuality in the Pastoral Epistles, as well as in the Pauline epistles as a whole, is try to understand it in a 1st or 2nd century context. Sex in the ancient world was often about power. The man had power over the woman in most contexts. And the focus here on the arsin okoitais is possibly a focus on breaking down the power struggle between the active and the passive male partner in a homosexual relationship. It also might have been a discussion of prostitution or of pederasty. Whatever the discussion here, the idea of homosexuality in this Greco-Roman context was quite a bit different from what we think about in a 21st century American context. Let's finally turn our attention to the topic of women in the Pastoral Epistles. Now, this is a point of contention for many women, as well as men, who read the Pastoral Epistles, sometimes even Pauline epistles as a whole, and really do not like what they say about women. Often not looking at the context of these passages, many people actually hate Paul by extension for what the passages say about women and women's roles in the church and society. Let's look at a couple passages here to get an idea of what the texts say about women's roles. First, in Titus, we see, likewise, tell the older women to be reverent in behavior, not to be slanderers or slaves to drink. They are to teach what is good, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be self-controlled, chaste, good managers of the household, kind, being submissive to their husbands, so that the word of God may not be discredited. 1 Timothy 2 says, Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. And finally, in 2 Timothy, For among them are those who make their way into households and captivate silly women, overwhelmed by their sins and swayed by all kinds of desires, who are always being instructed and can never arrive at a knowledge of the truth. These are some pretty heavy passages with their discussion of women, often calling them silly or telling them to be submissive. Let's look at a few of the things that we see in these texts. In the 1 Timothy passage, we see this letting women be silent and not teaching a man, which is often translated as, "Do not let a woman exercise authority over a man." What we see here is possibly a discussion of the idea of domineering. 1 Timothy seems to indicate that women should not have excessive authority over a man, just in the same way that he would probably indicate that men should not have excessive authority. The reason that the focus, however, is on women is because of some ancient sources and context that we have for this text. In ancient sources, we see women often murdering or having sex as a way to have power over men. This is probably what's in view when the author of 1 Timothy writes and says that women should not have authority over a man. The idea is not that women should not be able to teach, but that they should not be able to exercise authority in too much of a way. Again, we see often a focus on equality throughout the New Testament, so we want to make sure to look at the context of these passages. We also see that even though women are discussed in often negative ways throughout here, that Paul, whether he wrote these letters or not, does talk about many female deacons and apostles. For example, in Acts 16, Paul discusses Lydia, who is a dyer of purple cloth. Purple cloth would be used for royalty, so Lydia's role was quite important. She also founded a house church, according to the text. We also see Chloe in 1 Corinthians, who seems to be at least influential enough to have a messenger of her own to send to Paul. We often see a discussion of Junia, who is discussed as a kinsperson and, quote, outstanding among the apostles. It's interesting that Junia's name is often put into English translations as a male name, even though the Greek here is clearly a feminine name. And finally, we have discussion of Phoebe in Romans 16, 1-2, who is discussed as, in Greek, diakonon. Now, diakonon is a word that translates to our English as deacon. Deacon can mean many different things. It often means servant. It can also be a deacon in a church. And the word here can also mean benefactor. Many English translations translate Phoebe's role at diakonon as servant, rather than as benefactor or deacon. Again, as a way of male-centered translations changing what we see in this context. Diakonon in this case probably would be better translated as benefactor, because we have discussion of Phoebe's role in influencing the church and providing for it. In the other pastoral epistles, we see a discussion of women being silly and how they need to be submissive. One of the other things that could be at play here that many scholars talk about is the role of the false teachings that we see Paul, or at least Paul's followers, bring up a lot in the letters. One of these would be Gnosticism, and there could be an influence of women being perhaps susceptible to these teachings, according to what we see in the text, and then spreading these to others. So in the 1 Timothy passage, for example, we do have the issue of not exercising authority or domineering over a man, but also that the women are asking questions and interrupting services because they do not understand what's being talked about, perhaps because they're new converts, or because it's different from what they had been taught in other traditions. We see many other passages throughout Paul's letters where women are discussed. For example, as I mentioned earlier, in 1 Corinthians 11, we see a discussion of women praying and prophesying. Paul writes that women should cover their heads when praying or prophesying in church. And the context here is probably, again, about sexual availability. Any woman who was not veiled was probably in Greco-Roman culture, showing that she was sexually available. So Paul is arguing that women do not do this in an effort to fit into the culture better and essentially not distract people from the message that's being given. However, we do see, whatever the discussion is about covering their heads, that Paul does show women praying and prophesying in church in 1 Corinthians. We also see in 1 Corinthians 14 a discussion similar to what we see in Timothy about women talking in church. In verse 34 of chapter 14, Paul writes that women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. Again, the focus here is not on women actually not talking in church or being submissive, but simply a mistranslation of the Greek. In Greek, this word about submission is actually better translated as to subject themselves. It's a reflexive verb, not meaning to submit, but to submit to oneself. Essentially, this is like saying, hey, check yourself before you say something. The women are not supposed to not speak in church, but simply to think before they open their mouth about something, to make sure that they're understanding what's being discussed, and not to simply interrupt the church service. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain what the Pastoral Epistles say about slavery, homosexuality, and women in the New Testament. Describe how this relates to other parts and teachings in the New Testament, and explain the culture behind these teachings.